I read this book last year and I'm just now getting around to kind of going through it, trying to get my thoughts put together so I could do a good in-depth discussion about what's in here. Because it's, I think, one of the most important books that I've ever read in my life, really. It's the Notes of Debates in the Federal Convention of 1787, reported by James Madison. So these are his notes. But because it's quite involved and I really do want to do this book justice, I think I'm going to get into the details maybe at a later time, and today just kind of give a little bit of an introduction about what this is all about. So I've made some notes for myself to talk about this. This describes how the United States went from the Articles of Confederation to preparing the U.S. Constitution, which is in effect today. You know, we've had some amendments to it, which were allowed under the Constitution, but this is how they put that together. And so, just to describe the Articles of Confederation, this is what the colonies did to, work together during the Revolutionary War against Great Britain. And so they came together as 13 colonies, which were then 13 individual states. And they provided representatives to this Congress. And then there was a president of the Congress that was, established every year. So they had a different president every single year. And through those years that the Articles of Confederation were in effect, they found that there were a lot of problems with it. It just wasn't strong enough. So after the Revolutionary War was over, they were trying to pay debts and they couldn't get the individual states to make those payments. They couldn't ensure that the states would all abide by the treaties that had been signed. There were problems between the different states, and there was just not enough power under the Articles of Confederation to ensure that those things were handled properly. So they got together and had representatives from the states come together for this convention and talk about how they were going to change that and make, a more effective government. James Madison decided to take notes during the whole proceedings, and he was able to do that. And he talks about his reasoning for it, which I thought was really important. So I'm just going to read this section. He says, the curiosity I had felt during my researches into the history of the most distinguished confederacies, particularly those of antiquity, and the deficiency I found in the means of satisfying it, more especially in what related to the process, the principles, the reasons, and the anticipations which prevailed in the formation of them, determined me to preserve as far as I could an exact account of what might pass in the convention. So, kind of ancient sounding language, but what he's saying here is that, he looked in history to how they had put together republics. And what he found was that, they hadn't explained why they had put together those particular governments. And so it was hard to know, what were they trying to do and why didn't it work? And so when they're going through these debates and how they were going to put together this constitution, they did rely on, ancient governments and what went wrong. They also looked at current state governments in each of the individual 13 colonies, now states. And, all of those had governments and what was working and what wasn't working. They looked to modern governments in Europe, like Great Britain and Germany and France, and what was working and what wasn't working, to kind of decide how they were going to make a republic that would actually last. So anyway, I thought that was important to talk about why he put this together. And now somebody can look back here and know, as each person, said we should do this or we should do that, and somebody said no, we should do it this way, or should we do it that way, and what was the reasoning behind what they eventually came up with. We get more from these notes than you would from just a history of like, we decided that the president would be elected in this way and serve this much of a term, and he would have this many powers, and the legislature, same thing, and the judicial branch, this is how that would work. They actually talk about why they came up with this. So one of the things they talk about is they're oftentimes discussing the psychology of people and in society, and what causes people to do this or that. And it also shows how much it takes to compromise. Some of these states were just very different, and they had different in how they imagined this government would be, and so they had a very difficult time coming to a compromise about it, what it would be eventually. And just looking at how they did that, I think, is just really important to know, because that's what we do, nowadays, whether it's just in our individual lives compromising something, or in our government having to come up with a compromise to come to a resolution. And and it provides the reasoning for the final agreement. And so one of the things that I think was really important when I was reading this, kind of talking about the psychology of people and how we form governments, was Benjamin Franklin. And he was a pretty old guy by the time he was involved in this, and so he had written out what he was thinking and had somebody else stand up and read it for him. And I'm just going to read parts of it. And so Benjamin Franklin is, in this instance, speaking specifically to whether the executive of the government should be paid or not paid. And so I'm not really going to get into that. Eventually, they did have a salary for the people in government, but it does get to, people's psychology and thinking about the executive of a government. He says, "Sir, there are two passions which have a powerful influence on the affairs of men. These are ambition and avarice, the love of power and the love of money. Separately, each of these has great force in prompting men to action, but when united in view of the same object, they have in many minds the most violent effects." He goes on to say, "And of what kind are the men that will strive for this profitable preeminence? Through all the bustle of cabal, the heat of contention, the infinite mutual abuse of parties, tearing to pieces the best of characters, it will not be the wise and moderate, the lovers of peace and good order, the men fittest for the trust. It will be the bold and the violent, the men of strong passions and indefatigable activity in their selfish pursuits. These will thrust themselves into your government and be your rulers." He goes on to say, "It will be said that we don't propose to establish kings. I know it, but there is a natural inclination in mankind to kingly government. It sometimes relieves them from aristocratic domination. They had rather have one tyrant than 500. It gives more of the appearance of equality among citizens, and that they like. I am apprehensive, therefore, perhaps too apprehensive, that the government of these states may in future times end in a monarchy. But this catastrophe, I think, may be long delayed, if in our proposed system we do not sow the seeds of contention, faction, and tumult, by making our posts of honor places of profit." So anyway, I think he gets at that psychology, and I do think that human beings do tend to want one strong leader to force their opinions on everyone else. I've seen this in our country on the left and the right. I was on Reddit, probably years ago now, talking to this person on the left who was saying that she thought that President Biden should make a state of emergency because of the climate crisis. And of course, this is a situation, in our Constitution that the legislature makes the laws and the executive is supposed to just enforce those laws. But people just want the president to do what they want. And you see that on the right as well, wanting their ideas to be pushed through. And there's just a reluctance to accept that, our Congress is going to have to, it takes more time, and there has to be compromise, and it's not going to be just one way or the other in order to get things done. And so people look to the president to somehow enforce this when the Constitution doesn't give that person those powers. So even in my lifetime, I've seen that happen, and it just seems to have accelerated recently under President Trump, where, Congress has made laws and appropriated funds for certain things, and then those funds are pulled back, and the laws aren't necessarily being faithfully executed. And so it really seems very much like we are kind of coming towards this end where we establishing this essentially a monarchy. And so I wanted to talk about that today, because today is No King's Day, and people will be out marching in the streets. I'm here in Colorado. I can't, so I want to push, my support behind everyone, because I think that people do need to be the ones to make sure that we don't continue in that direction, and that we can still have a republic